The catastrophe described by John occurred less than 1,000 years ago. The aftermath of planetary disorder took centuries to sort itself out. It was only in the 16th century that the solar system was stable enough to institute a calendar reform accounting for the new planetary relationships. This is known as the Gregorian calendar reform of 1582. It is not our intent at this point to analyze the Gregorian calendar reform in any depth. Suffice it to say that any attempt to retrocalculate the positions of the planets prior to the reform will be futile. Before the calendar reform, the planets were not moving in the orbits we see today. Returning to Ridwan and the supernova of 1006, we can conclude that whatever the positions of the planets recorded by the Arabic astronomer were, they could not have predated the Gregorian calendar reform. The supernova event described by Ridwan occurred centuries later and was likely a duplicate, perhaps of Tycho's nova in 1572 or Kepler's star in 1604. Another important point is that the supernova of Ridwan could not be the Star of Bethlehem. The mere fact that Ridwan records a ephemeris disqualifies the event. We know that at the time of the birth of Jesus Christ, the planets Earth, Mars, Venus, and Saturn were in polar alignment. It was only after his crucifixion that the planets left this unique configuration. The case for the dating of the 1006 supernova relies almost exclusively on Ali ibn Ridwan's commentary on a work by Claudius Ptolemy, the Tetrabiblos. Ptolemy is alleged to have lived in the 2nd century AD. Of course, this is according to the current consensual chronology, which at the very least is 1 millennium out of kilter. Using a chain of custody approach to Ptolemy's most famous works, we find that Ptolemy lived no earlier than the 9th century and most likely centuries later. Ptolemy's geography is believed to have been written in 150 AD. However, this cannot be substantiated by chain of custody. Every manuscript copy of the geography dates from the 13th century or later. The dates of the early manuscripts are dubious. The first editions with maps were published only in the late 15th century, which are more likely closer to the time Ptolemy actually wrote the work. The Geographia contains longitudes and latitudes of locations given in degrees. This is a historical anachronism belonging to a more modern science of mapmaking. The famous Almagest of Ptolemy, his treatise on mathematics and astronomy, is said to have been written in approximately 150 AD. No originals of the Almagest survive, with the earliest translations first appearing in the 9th century. The Almagest is a compendium of astronomical theory and calculations, including the motions of the Sun, Moon, and planets. Given that there were no planetary motions per se before the crucifixion of Jesus Christ, approximately 1,000 years after the supposed writing of the Almagest, the dating of the work cannot possibly be assigned to the 2nd century AD. Even modern astronomers admit that Ptolemy's astronomical observations cannot be matched with a 2nd century solar system. The observations of Ptolemy are so anomalous with what retrocalculations demand they should be that one scientist, Robert Newton, called Ptolemy a fraud. He contended that Ptolemy deliberately falsified his results. The so-called problems of Ptolemy's Almagest disappear if we assume that the work is the product of late medieval observations and calculations, and that Ptolemy himself was a late medieval character. Ptolemy's Tetrabiblos, the work in question with regard to the supernova of 1006, must also be considered late medieval. Like its companion work, the Almagest, the Tetrabiblos was first translated into Arabic in the 9th century. The Tetrabiblos was a text on astrology and was written after the Almagest. The point here, of course, is that if the Almagest is a late medieval work, then the Tetrabiblos, written after the Almagest, must be late medieval as well. This makes any commentary, including that of Ridwan, also late medieval. The Tetrabiblos relies on the observations of the Almagest, which, in turn, could only have been made after the crucifixion event, and likely much later. This effectively precludes that the supernova seen by Ridwan occurred in 1006.